The frozen lake stretched endlessly beneath the Alaskan wilderness, its surface a mirror reflecting the pale winter sky that would soon swallow Rachel Monroe's dreams whole. Beneath 3 feet of crystalline ice, her lifeless body lay twisted in an unnatural pose, wedding ring still gleaming on her finger, honeymoon luggage scattered nearby like broken promises. Just 72 hours earlier, she had been laughing in her husband's arms, believing she had found her soulmate in the rugged wilderness guide who promised her adventure and forever. Instead, Ethan Cole had delivered her to a grave so remote that even the ravens avoided its silence. Rachel Monroe had always believed that love could conquer anything. The 28-year-old wildlife photographer from Portland, Oregon, possessed the kind of optimistic spirit that saw beauty in storm clouds and possibility in every sunrise. Her camera captured moments of pure wilderness, magic, frame by frame, building a portfolio that spoke of deep connection with nature's untamed essence. She lived for the thrill of tracking elusive mountain goats through Rocky Mountain passes, for the patient hours spent waiting for the perfect shot of migrating salmon, for the profound solitude that only true wilderness could provide. When Rachel met Ethan Cole through an online adventure photography forum, she thought she had discovered her perfect match. His profile showcased a ruggedly handsome 32-year-old Alaskan outdoor guide whose knowledge of remote terrain seemed limitless. His messages spoke of untouched landscapes and wildlife encounters that made her heart race with anticipation. Here was a man who understood her passion, who could guide her to locations she had only dreamed of photographing. Their digital courtship unfolded over months of shared wilderness stories, late-night video calls where he described the ethereal beauty of northern lights dancing across endless tundra. Ethan presented himself as the embodiment of Alaskan authenticity, born and raised in Anchorage, returned after college to establish his guiding business. Rachel saw in him not just a romantic partner, but a gateway to the ultimate wildlife photography career she had always envisioned. But beneath Ethan's charming exterior lurked a darkness that Rachel never suspected. Court records from smaller Alaskan communities revealed a pattern of restraining orders filed by previous girlfriends, women who had discovered too late that his protective nature masked dangerous possessiveness. These records, buried in jurisdictions with limited digital access, never surfaced during Rachel's excited research into her future husband's background. Rachel's arrival in Anchorage marked the beginning of what should have been the most magical week of her life. The airport terminal buzzed with controlled chaos, travelers arriving with ski equipment and camera gear, departing with stories of wilderness encounters that would last lifetimes. Ethan met her at baggage claim with the easy smile that had first captured her attention, his weathered hands gentle as he helped gather her photography equipment, his eyes bright with promises of adventures ahead. The drive to their accommodation revealed Anchorage in its winter glory, mountains rising dramatically beyond the city limits, snow-covered peaks catching afternoon light that turned them pink and gold. Rachel pressed her face to the passenger window, already composing shots in her mind, mentally cataloging locations she wanted to return to with proper lighting. Their honeymoon cabin sat on the shores of Turnagain Arm, 30 miles from downtown, surrounded by wilderness that stretched unbroken to the horizon. Their first night together as a married couple unfolded with romantic perfection that seemed almost orchestrated. Ethan prepared dinner over the wood-burning stove, local salmon paired with vegetables he claimed to have preserved himself during the summer months. Wine from a bottle he had been saving accompanied their meal, candlelight flickering across his features as he shared stories of locations they would explore together. But subtle signs of Ethan's true nature began emerging even during that first evening, warning signals that Rachel's romantic euphoria prevented her from recognizing. His questions about her past relationships carried an undertone of jealousy disguised as casual interest. When Rachel mentioned solo photography trips she had taken, his responses contained gentle criticisms about the risks she had accepted, suggestions that her independence had been reckless rather than admirable. Morning brought their first full day of honeymoon exploration, Ethan rising before dawn to prepare breakfast and organize equipment for their planned expedition to photograph sunrise over the Chugach Mountains. The photographic expedition began with promise, Ethan's knowledge of local terrain proving invaluable as he guided them to vantage points that offered spectacular compositions. Rachel's camera captured frame after frame of pristine wilderness, ice formations that glowed like sculptures, mountain peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. But as the day progressed, subtle tensions began to surface in their interaction. Ethan's suggestions about camera settings carried implications that Rachel's technical knowledge was inadequate, his recommendations about composition suggesting that her artistic eye needed guidance. When Rachel expressed interest in exploring locations beyond their planned itinerary, his responses emphasized dangers and difficulties rather than possibilities. The argument that evening concluded with Ethan's apparent capitulation, his apology for being overly protective, his promise to support her artistic vision more fully during the remaining days of their honeymoon. Rachel accepted his explanation, interpreting his concerns as evidence of love rather than recognizing the control he was attempting to establish. That night, as Rachel updated her social media accounts with stunning photographs from their first day, she crafted captions that painted their honeymoon in glowing terms. Emily Davis, reading these updates from Portland, felt relieved that her concerns about the hasty marriage appeared to have been unfounded. Wenn diese tiefgreifende True Crime Dokumentation gefällt und du mehr über die dunkelsten Geheimnisse menschlicher Psyche erfahren möchtest, dann abonniere jetzt unseren Kanal. Rachels Geschichte zeigt, wie schnell Träume zu Albträumen werden können, und sie ist nur eine von vielen erschütternden Wahrheiten, die wir aufdecken. Verpasse nicht unsere nächste Dokumentation über Fälle, die selbst erfahrene Ermittler sprachlos machen. The second day dawned with deceptive tranquility, pale sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows, where Rachel prepared for what would unknowingly be her penultimate day alive. Ethan's attentiveness to her breakfast preferences, his careful preparation of photography equipment, his enthusiastic descriptions of the day's planned locations, all contributed to an atmosphere of loving partnership that masked his calculating assessment of her vulnerabilities. Their destination lay deep within Chugach State Park, accessible only by snowmobile across terrain that challenged even experienced wilderness travelers. The isolation of their chosen location was both thrilling and unsettling, miles from the nearest human habitation, with no cell phone coverage to connect them to civilization. Rachel's urban background made such complete wilderness immersion simultaneously exhilarating and anxiety-provoking. Photography opportunities exceeded even Rachel's optimistic expectations, wildlife encounters that would have taken weeks to achieve in more accessible locations, occurring within hours of their arrival. Her camera captured images of Arctic foxes hunting against pristine snow, ptarmigan camouflaged so perfectly they seemed part of the landscape itself, ice formations that resembled crystal cathedrals, carved by wind and temperature. But subtle changes in Ethan's behavior became apparent as they worked deeper into the wilderness, modifications so gradual that Rachel's focused attention on photography prevented her from recognizing their significance. His conversations began incorporating subtle criticisms of her past independent travels, questions that implied her previous solo expeditions had been foolishly risky rather than professionally courageous. The psychological manipulation accelerated as physical isolation deepened, Ethan's comments designed to undermine Rachel's confidence in her abilities while reinforcing her dependence on his expertise. When she successfully identified animal tracks without his assistance, he corrected minor details in ways that suggested her knowledge was incomplete. His praise for her photography was increasingly qualified, compliments followed by suggestions for improvements that implied her artistic vision needed his refinement. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the frozen landscape, Rachel began experiencing the first genuine fears about her husband's intentions. His references to her vulnerability in wilderness settings had shifted from protective concern to what felt like veiled threats, observations about how easily accidents could occur to inexperienced travelers who ventured beyond their capabilities. Evening conversation revealed the extent to which Rachel's psychological equilibrium had been disrupted by just 2 days of calculated manipulation. Her descriptions of the day's photography successes were tentative rather than confident, seeking Ethan's validation rather than expressing artistic satisfaction. The woman who had arrived in Alaska bursting with confidence and independence was already transforming into someone who questioned her own judgment and abilities. That night, Rachel lay awake beside her sleeping husband, struggling to understand the anxiety that prevented rest despite physical exhaustion from their demanding day. She had no way of knowing that Ethan was also lying awake, calculating the timing and logistics of the violence he had been planning since their wedding day. Dawn on the third day brought weather conditions that would have deterred most wilderness expeditions, but Ethan insisted that such challenges offered unique photographic opportunities that could distinguish Rachel's portfolio from conventional Alaska imagery. Heavy snow had fallen during the night, transforming familiar landscapes into alien terrain where landmarks disappeared beneath blankets of white. Rachel's mounting anxiety about the increasingly extreme nature of their expeditions was consistently dismissed by Ethan's confident assertions about his wilderness expertise and knowledge of local conditions. Her suggestions about postponing their planned excursion until weather improved were met with implications that her urban background made her overly cautious, that true wilderness photography required embracing rather than avoiding challenging conditions. The route Ethan selected led deeper into uninhabited territory than any of their previous expeditions, requiring snowshoe travel across terrain that tested Rachel's physical endurance and navigation skills. Technical equipment failures that should have been minor inconveniences became significant challenges given their extreme isolation. When her camera battery died despite careful charging the previous evening, his spare batteries proved incompatible with her equipment, a detail that seemed suspicious in retrospect. Wildlife encounters that had provided excitement during previous days began taking on more ominous characteristics as Rachel's psychological state deteriorated under sustained manipulation. Ethan's stories about dangerous animal behaviors in winter conditions were detailed and frightening, emphasizing her vulnerability and inexperience while positioning himself as her essential protector. Their midday rest stop occurred at a frozen waterfall that created ice formations resembling cathedral architecture. The setting should have inspired awe and artistic excitement, but Rachel found herself increasingly focused on practical concerns about their return journey and the wisdom of continuing deeper into wilderness under deteriorating conditions. The afternoon's exploration pushed beyond even Ethan's previously acknowledged boundaries, venturing into territory he claimed to know but where his navigation seemed less certain than during their earlier travels. Rachel's growing suspicions about his familiarity with the route were countered by his detailed descriptions of landmarks, but inconsistencies in his explanations began creating doubt about his wilderness expertise. As daylight began its early winter fade, Rachel's request to begin their return journey became increasingly urgent, driven by survival instincts that overcame her reluctance to challenge Ethan's authority. His responses revealed a fundamental shift in their dynamic, authoritative dismissals that abandoned any pretense of partnership in favor of domination. The discovery of their intended campsite revealed preparations that Ethan claimed to have made during previous solo expeditions, but the remote shelter seemed too convenient and well-equipped to be coincidental. The cabin's existence implied premeditation that transformed their honeymoon from romantic adventure to what increasingly resembled a carefully orchestrated trap. Evening brought the first explicit conflict between Rachel's desire to return to civilization and Ethan's insistence that they continue deeper into wilderness for additional days of exploration. Her arguments about safety concerns met with angry responses that revealed controlling behaviors he had previously concealed behind protective concern. That night, confined in the remote shelter with a man whose behavior had become overtly threatening, Rachel experienced genuine terror for the first time in their relationship. The wilderness that had initially inspired her now felt like a prison, beautiful but deadly, with escape routes known only to someone who had already demonstrated that her safety was not his priority. The fourth morning dawned with crystalline clarity that illuminated the treacherous beauty of Rachel's predicament. Ethan's behavior had undergone a complete transformation overnight, the charming wilderness guide replaced by someone whose cold calculation revealed predatory nature that romantic infatuation had previously concealed. Rachel woke to find herself truly alone for the first time since arriving in Alaska, her husband having departed the shelter before dawn without explanation. The isolation was both terrifying and liberating, providing the first opportunity for clear thinking that Rachel had experienced since their expedition began. Without Ethan's constant psychological manipulation and subtle intimidation, she could finally assess her situation with analytical skills that had made her a successful photographer. The remote location, extreme weather conditions, and her complete dependence on someone whose intentions had become questionable created a survival scenario unlike anything she had previously encountered. Her attempts to establish communication with the outside world confirmed the extent of their isolation. Her cell phone remained without signal, the emergency beacon buried in equipment that Ethan had insisted on organizing and carrying himself. The GPS device showed their location as a small dot surrounded by hundreds of square miles of uninhabited wilderness, with the nearest road system requiring days of travel through terrain that could prove fatal to inexperienced hikers. When Ethan finally returned to the shelter near midday, his demeanor had shifted again, this time to artificial cheerfulness that felt more menacing than his previous coldness. He carried fresh supplies that he claimed to have retrieved from cached equipment, but Rachel suspected he had simply been conducting reconnaissance or preparing for activities he preferred to keep secret from her. His explanation for the morning's absence was vague and contradictory. References to checking weather conditions and route options that didn't align with their current location or stated plans. Rachel's questions about their return schedule were deflected with promises of spectacular photographic opportunities that supposedly required extending their wilderness stay indefinitely. The afternoon brought the most frightening escalation yet in Ethan's psychological campaign. His comments became explicitly threatening. Detailed descriptions of wilderness, accidents that befell photographers who failed to follow local guidance or who attempted to travel independently. The stories carried clear implications that Rachel's survival depended entirely on his continued goodwill and protection. Her attempts to assert independence or express desire to return to civilization were met with rage that revealed the extent of his controlling pathology. The mask of charming wilderness guide had completely fallen away, replaced by someone whose capacity for violence was becoming increasingly apparent. Rachel realized with growing horror that she was completely at the mercy of a man whose intentions toward her were clearly malevolent. As evening approached, Ethan's preparations took on ritualistic quality that suggested the approaching climax of whatever scenario he had been orchestrating since their wedding. His organization of equipment, his detailed examination of weather conditions, his careful inventory of their supplies, all pointed toward activities that required specific timing and conditions. That night represented Rachel's last opportunity to escape or defend herself, though she had no way of knowing that morning would never come for her. Her desperate attempts to appear compliant, while secretly preparing for flight or fight, were observed by someone whose experience with wilderness predation had taught him to recognize and counter every survival instinct his victims might possess. February 15th arrived with the kind of pristine Arctic morning that transforms Alaska's wilderness into a crystalline cathedral of death. Rachel Monroe woke for the final time to find Ethan Cole standing over her sleeping bag, his silhouette backlit by dawn filtering through the shelter's single window. The expression on his face carried none of the artificial warmth that had characterized their previous days together, replaced instead by cold calculation that finally revealed his true intentions without pretense or deception. The transformation in his demeanor was so complete that Rachel initially wondered if she was experiencing a nightmare, but the bitter cold seeping through inadequate insulation and the ache in her muscles from days of challenging wilderness travel confirmed the terrible reality of her situation. Ethan's voice, when he finally spoke, carried tones of authority and ownership that left no doubt about the power dynamic that had been developing throughout their honeymoon expedition. His instructions were delivered with military precision, orders rather than suggestions about their final day's activities. The photographic expedition he outlined would take them to the most remote location yet, a frozen lake surrounded by peaks where no rescue would be possible even if someone realized they were missing. Rachel's questions about safety equipment and emergency communications were dismissed with contempt that made clear her welfare was no longer a consideration in his planning. The journey to their final destination required several hours of grueling snowshoe travel across terrain that tested even Rachel's considerable outdoor experience. Ethan's pace was relentless, driven by timeline requirements that he refused to explain, but which created urgency that prevented rest or reconsideration. Rachel's growing exhaustion was met with implications that her weakness demonstrated why women needed male protection in wilderness environments. The lake itself was stunningly beautiful, a mirror surface of ice surrounded by peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. Under different circumstances, the location would have provided photographic opportunities that could have established Rachel's reputation as a serious wilderness photographer. Instead, the isolation and beauty became the backdrop for violence that would transform paradise into a crime scene. Ethan's final psychological manipulation involved detailed descriptions of the accident that was about to occur explanations delivered with scientific detachment that revealed extensive prior planning. Rachel's attempts to flee or fight were anticipated and countered with professional efficiency that suggested this was not his first experience with wilderness murder. Her pleas for mercy were met with silence more terrifying than any verbal threat. The actual violence was swift and brutal. Ethan's wilderness survival skills applied to ensure that Rachel's death appeared accidental, while guaranteeing that no evidence would survive to contradict his eventual testimony. Her body was positioned beneath the ice with care that would make discovery difficult, while creating physical evidence, supporting his planned narrative about a tragic mishap during their romantic adventure. As Rachel Monroe's lifeless form settled into its frozen grave, Ethan Cole began the careful process of establishing his alibi and preparing the performance that would convince investigators of his innocence. The man who had courted her with promises of adventure and partnership had delivered exactly what he promised, though the ultimate destination had always been death rather than the life of shared wilderness exploration she had envisioned. Emily Davis received the phone call that would haunt her dreams at 7:30 in the evening, 3 days after she should have heard from Rachel about the honeymoon's conclusion. Ethan Cole's voice on the other end of the line carried precisely the right mixture of panic and grief, his performance crafted through hours of rehearsal as he had traveled back to civilization to report his wife's tragic death. The story he told was heartbreaking in its simplicity, a tale of adventure gone wrong that transformed their romantic expedition into an unspeakable tragedy. According to Ethan's carefully constructed narrative, Rachel had insisted on photographing sunrise over the frozen lake, despite his warnings about unstable ice conditions. Her artistic passion had overridden practical caution, leading her to venture onto ice that appeared solid but concealed deadly weakness beneath its crystalline surface. The crack that opened beneath her feet had been sudden and unexpected, swallowing her so quickly that even his immediate rescue attempts proved futile. His description of the hours he had spent trying to recover her body was delivered with emotional authenticity that would have convinced anyone who hadn't witnessed his calculating coldness during the actual murder. The image of a devoted husband desperately diving into frigid water, risking his own life in hopeless attempts to save his beloved wife, created sympathy that deflected suspicion from his role in her death. Emily's initial response was shock so profound that she struggled to process the information Ethan was providing. Rachel's enthusiasm for their honeymoon adventure had been infectious, her social media posts radiating happiness and excitement about the photographic opportunities Alaska offered. The contrast between her friend's recent joy and the tragedy Ethan described seemed impossible to reconcile with rational understanding. But even in her grief-stricken state, Emily detected inconsistencies in Ethan's account that triggered the same concerns she had expressed before the wedding. Rachel's wilderness experience was extensive, her understanding of environmental dangers sophisticated enough to avoid obvious risks like unstable ice. The woman who had successfully navigated challenging terrain across multiple continents was unlikely to make the kind of amateur mistake that Ethan's story required. Alaska State Trooper Jack Reynolds received the official report of Rachel's death at his Anchorage headquarters 4 hours after Ethan's emotional call to Emily. The case file that landed on his desk appeared straightforward, another tragic reminder of the wilderness dangers that claimed unprepared tourists every year. Ethan Cole's reputation as an experienced guide and his obvious grief over his wife's death created initial presumption that the incident was exactly what it appeared to be. However, Reynolds' 15 years of experience investigating wilderness fatalities had taught him to look beyond surface appearances, particularly in cases involving recently married couples and remote locations. The statistical correlation between domestic violence and wilderness accidents was well documented in law enforcement circles, though proving murder in such cases required evidence that careful perpetrators rarely left behind. The crime scene that Reynolds and his team discovered 2 days later told a story that didn't entirely align with Ethan's reported sequence of events. The positioning of Rachel's body beneath the ice suggested she had been unconscious or already deceased when she entered the water, her limbs arranged in patterns inconsistent with drowning victim behavior. The absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle could be explained by surprise, attack, or incapacitation, but definitive proof would require forensic analysis that might not be conclusive. Ethan's behavior during the initial investigation was textbook perfect, his cooperation complete, while maintaining the emotional devastation expected from a grieving widower. His willingness to provide detailed accounts of their relationship, their honeymoon plans, and the circumstances of Rachel's death created an impression of transparency that deflected suspicion while actually providing opportunities to establish his innocence through consistent storytelling. The search of their cabin revealed a honeymoon suite that appeared exactly as Ethan described, a romantic retreat where a loving couple had planned to begin their married life together. Rachel's photography equipment was arranged with care that suggested artistic passion, her personal belongings positioned in ways that indicated comfort and trust in her environment. Nothing in the physical evidence contradicted Ethan's narrative of tragic accident during an adventure that had been proceeding normally until the final morning. Detective Sarah Klein joined the investigation 3 days after the body's discovery, bringing specialized experience in domestic violence cases and suspicious death investigations. Her reputation for uncovering hidden motives behind apparent accidents made her assignment to the case routine, but her initial review of the evidence revealed patterns that warranted closer examination, despite the lack of obvious contradictions in Ethan's account. Klein's background research into Ethan Cole uncovered the restraining orders that had been filed in smaller Alaskan communities, legal documents that painted a picture of escalating violence that contradicted his public reputation as a gentle wilderness guide. The pattern of controlling behavior, followed by explosive violence when challenged, aligned perfectly with psychological profiles of men who murdered intimate partners, though connecting his documented history to Rachel's death would require evidence that might not exist. Detective Sarah Klein's investigation into Ethan Cole's background revealed a pattern of violence that had been carefully concealed behind his public reputation as Alaska's premier wilderness guide. The restraining orders filed by 3 previous girlfriends painted a disturbing picture of escalating control and abuse, each relationship following an identical trajectory from romantic courtship to psychological manipulation to explicit threats that had driven his victims to seek legal protection. Jennifer Martinez, Ethan's girlfriend from 2 years earlier, had filed court documents describing his transformation from charming adventure companion to possessive controller who monitored her communications and restricted her social interactions. Her testimony detailed his expertise in using Alaska's isolation to create situations where she was completely dependent on his goodwill for basic survival, tactics that appeared to have been perfected during his relationship with Rachel. The second restraining order, filed by Lisa Chen 6 months before Ethan met Rachel, described even more disturbing behavior. Chen's affidavit detailed explicit threats Ethan had made about wilderness, accidents that could befall women who failed to appreciate his protection, language that aligned disturbingly with the circumstances of Rachel's death. Her description of his detailed knowledge of remote locations where bodies would never be discovered provided insight into planning capabilities that suggested premeditation rather than impulsive violence. Klein's interview with Amanda Foster, the most recent ex-girlfriend to seek legal protection from Ethan, revealed the sophistication of his psychological manipulation techniques. Foster described how Ethan would gradually isolate his partners from support networks, using romantic wilderness expeditions to create dependence while systematically undermining their confidence and independence. Her account of barely escaping a camping trip that she later realized had been planned, as her murder provided crucial context for understanding Rachel's final days. The financial investigation into Ethan's business records revealed irregularities that suggested his wilderness guiding operation provided cover for activities beyond legitimate tourism. Bank deposits that didn't align with reported client bookings, equipment purchases that exceeded normal business requirements, and insurance policies that seemed designed to benefit from client accidents rather than protect against normal business liabilities all pointed toward systematic exploitation of his position as a trusted guide. Klein's examination of Ethan's online communications with Rachel revealed manipulation techniques that perfectly matched the patterns described by his previous victims. His messages demonstrated systematic assessment of her vulnerabilities, careful cultivation of dependence, and gradual escalation of control that culminated in the honeymoon expedition where he would have complete power over her survival. The digital record provided a blueprint of premeditated murder disguised as romantic courtship. The forensic examination of Rachel's body, conducted by Alaska's chief medical examiner Dr. Robert Hayes, revealed evidence that contradicted Ethan's account of accidental drowning. Bruising patterns on her throat were consistent with strangulation, while the absence of water in her lungs indicated she had been deceased before entering the lake. The positioning of her wedding ring, removed and then replaced after death, suggested post-mortem manipulation designed to support Ethan's narrative of tragic accident. Physical evidence from the crime scene, re-examined with knowledge of Ethan's violent history, revealed details that supported murder rather than accident. Tool marks on the ice indicated artificial weakening rather than natural fracture, while footprint analysis showed movement patterns inconsistent with Ethan's reported rescue attempts. The careful arrangement of Rachel's photography equipment suggested staging designed to support his story of her tragic pursuit of the perfect shot. Emily Davis provided crucial testimony about Rachel's wilderness experience and safety consciousness, describing years of successful solo expeditions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of environmental dangers. Her friend's extensive training in wilderness survival and emergency response made the kind of amateur mistake Ethan described extremely unlikely, while her documented caution about ice conditions during previous expeditions contradicted the reckless behavior his story required. The breakthrough in Klein's investigation came through analysis of Ethan's cell phone records, which revealed communications with individuals who specialized in creating false identities and disposing of evidence. The timing of these contacts, occurring during his courtship of Rachel, proved premeditation, while the content suggested he had been planning her murder from their earliest interactions. The digital evidence transformed their romantic relationship into a carefully orchestrated predatory campaign. Ethan's arrest occurred at his Anchorage cabin, where Klein and her team discovered evidence of his preparations for disposing of Rachel's body and establishing his alibi. The basement workshop contained tools for ice manipulation, detailed maps of remote wilderness locations suitable for body disposal, and documentation of previous scouting trips to the lake where Rachel died. His shocked protests of innocence were contradicted by physical evidence that revealed months of planning for her murder. The trial of Ethan Cole began on a frigid March morning in Anchorage Superior Court, attracting media attention that transformed Rachel Monroe's tragic death into a cautionary tale about online romance and wilderness dangers. Prosecutor Maria Santos opened the case with devastating efficiency, laying out evidence that revealed the systematic predatory campaign Ethan had conducted against multiple women, culminating in Rachel's carefully planned murder during their honeymoon expedition. The prosecution's case was built around the testimony of Ethan's previous victims, women whose courage in facing their abuser provided crucial context for understanding the psychological manipulation that had preceded Rachel's death. Jennifer Martinez, Lisa Chen, and Amanda Foster each described identical patterns of behavior that demonstrated Ethan's sophisticated understanding of how to isolate and control women who trusted him with their lives in wilderness settings. Emily Davis's testimony provided heartbreaking insight into Rachel's final days, revealing text messages that showed her growing anxiety about Ethan's behavior during their honeymoon. Her description of Rachel's excitement about their Alaska adventure, contrasted with subtle concerns about Ethan's controlling tendencies, painted a picture of a woman who had realized too late that she had married a predator rather than a protector. The forensic evidence presented by Dr. Hayes was unambiguous in contradicting Ethan's accident narrative. Medical testimony confirmed that Rachel had been strangled before her body was placed beneath the ice, while physical evidence from the crime scene revealed artificial manipulation designed to support Ethan's story of tragic drowning. The careful staging of her death demonstrated premeditation that elevated the charges from manslaughter to first-degree murder. Detective Klein's investigation was presented with methodical thoroughness that revealed the extent of Ethan's planning and preparation. Financial records, communication logs, and physical evidence from his property all supported the prosecution's argument that Rachel's murder had been planned from their earliest interactions. The digital trail of his research into disposal methods and alibi creation provided compelling evidence of calculated predatory behavior. The defense strategy, orchestrated by attorney Michael Chen, attempted to portray Ethan as a grief-stricken husband whose reputation was being destroyed by coincidental evidence and prosecutorial overreach. Their argument centered on the absence of witnesses to Rachel's actual death, suggesting that forensic evidence could be interpreted in ways that supported accidental drowning rather than murder. The defense portrayed Ethan's previous restraining orders as misunderstandings rather than evidence of violent tendencies. However, The defense case was undermined by Ethan's own behavior during interrogation, recorded interviews that revealed inconsistencies in his account, and psychological responses that suggested guilt rather than grief. His detailed knowledge of body disposal techniques, supposedly acquired through his wilderness guiding work, included information that exceeded normal professional requirements and aligned with criminal rather than rescue applications. The jury deliberation lasted only 18 hours, their verdict reflecting the overwhelming weight of evidence that convicted Ethan of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The systematic nature of his predatory campaign against multiple victims, combined with the premeditated planning revealed through digital and physical evidence, supported the prosecution's argument that Rachel's death represented the culmination of a pattern of escalating violence rather than an isolated incident. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Ethan Cole to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, her statement emphasizing the calculated nature of his crimes and the necessity of protecting future potential victims from his predatory behavior. The sentence reflected not only justice for Rachel's murder, but recognition that Ethan's sophisticated manipulation techniques and wilderness expertise made him an ongoing danger to any woman who might trust him with her safety. Rachel Monroe's death became a catalyst for changes in Alaska's wilderness tourism industry, leading to enhanced background check requirements for professional guides and improved safety protocols for remote expeditions. Her tragic story, preserved through Emily Davis's advocacy work, serves as a warning about the dangers of trusting romantic partners whose credentials haven't been thoroughly verified through independent sources rather than carefully curated online profiles. The Rachel Monroe Foundation, established by her family and friends, provides resources for women experiencing domestic violence in remote or isolated communities where traditional support services may be unavailable. The organization's work honors her memory by addressing the specific vulnerabilities that predators like Ethan Cole exploit, offering escape planning assistance and safety education tailored to wilderness and rural environments. Emily Davis continues her friend's photographic work, completing the wildlife portfolio Rachel had been developing before her death and ensuring that her artistic legacy survives alongside the cautionary tale of her murder. The images Rachel captured during her final days in Alaska, recovered from equipment scattered around the crime scene, provide haunting testament to her talent and passion, while serving as evidence of the dreams that Ethan Cole's violence destroyed forever. Ethan Cole remains incarcerated at Alaska's Spring Creek Correctional Center, where his appeals have been consistently denied and his requests for reduced security classification rejected due to ongoing assessment that he represents significant danger to any women who might encounter him. Prison psychologists have noted his continued refusal to accept responsibility for Rachel's murder, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of premeditation and systematic predatory behavior. The three women who survived Ethan's previous relationships have rebuilt their lives with varying degrees of success, their courage in testifying against him, providing closure while highlighting the broader pattern of violence that Rachel's case brought to light. Their advocacy work has contributed to improved legal protections for domestic violence victims and enhanced training for law enforcement officers investigating suspicious wilderness deaths. Detective Sarah Klein's investigation techniques, refined through Rachel's case, have been adopted by agencies across Alaska and other states with significant wilderness tourism industries. Her methods for uncovering predatory behavior disguised as professional service have resulted in additional convictions and the prevention of crimes that might otherwise have been dismissed as tragic accidents rather than calculated murders. Rachel Monroe's story serves as an enduring reminder that evil often disguises itself as protection, that predators frequently exploit the trust and vulnerability that romantic love creates, and that even the most beautiful wilderness can become a tomb when shared with someone whose intentions are malevolent. Her death was not meaningless if it prevents other women from falling victim to men who use charm and expertise to mask violent intentions, transforming romantic adventures into carefully orchestrated murders that leave families forever broken by preventable tragedy.